The mission of the World Affairs Council is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do that with the help of 50 local businesses like Sound Off Signal and all of our colleges and universities. And we're very grateful to Grand Valley State University for being a part of it, and the Seidman School providing this wonderful space for us to have this event. Now let me briefly introduce the ambassador to you and then have him come up and lead us. Chase Untermeyer is chairman of the Qatar America Institute, which aims to increase understanding of the important Qatari-American relationship in security, education, and energy. From 2004 to 2007, he served as the U.S. ambassador to Qatar on appointment of President George W. Bush. He has held positions at all 4 levels of government, local, state, national, and international, over a period of more than 30 years, with work in journalism, academia, and business as well. He was born in Long Branch, New Jersey, which I was happy to talk with him about, Jersey Shore, and he came to Houston at the age of 2. He is a 1968 graduate of Harvard with honors in government, and while in college, he helped George H.W. Bush in his 1966 race for a seat in Congress from Houston, and spent 2 summers as an intern on the Washington staff for freshman Congressman Bush. He's commissioned under the Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps, and he served in the Navy during the Vietnam War as an officer aboard the Pacific Fleet destroyer, the USS Benner. After 2 terms as a Texas state representative, his good friend George H.W. Bush asked him to come to Washington when Mr. Bush became vice president. His many, many additional adventures in government and public service, and including executive positions in the Navy and of Voice of America, and as assistant to the president, and of course, as U.S. ambassador to Qatar. Please join me in welcoming Chase Untermeyer.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mike and Erica and all for the chance to be here, particularly on a beautiful autumn day, coming from the tropics down there in Houston to see trees that are naturally colored as opposed to artificially colored is a great, great thrill. Also had the pleasure with Mike of going back to the Ford Presidential Museum today, and I was reminded that my very last trip to Grand Rapids was September 18th, 1981, which was when the museum opened. I was then working for then Vice President Bush. He was there along with President and Mrs. Reagan and Pierre Trudeau and various other luminaries. So that was a highly memorable time. I'm sorry it's been 37 years since that visit, but thanks to Erica and company, I'm here and so grateful. I also realize that I am a second choice Untermeyer to come here because my wife, Diana, who wrote a book about Qatar called Qatar, Sand, Sea, and Sky, spoke before the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan about 5 or 6 years ago. Some of you may have been here for that. You got a much better talk from her than you will get from me, and so I can only try. But she's safely 1,000 miles away, and I have the floor to myself. But to begin, my tenure in Qatar was for 3 years during a very dynamic time, and it was a totally new experience for me and for our entire little family. That's because I was what is known as a non-career or political appointed ambassador. In any given administration of either party, 2/3 of all ambassadors are career foreign service officers, people who, very bright graduates who take an exam. Sometimes they have to take it more than once, and through a very stringent interview process are selected to enter the Foreign Service, at which point they rise in ranks just like in the military, to the point when after 20, 25 years, the State Department identifies them as a good candidate to recommend to the White House for posting as an ambassador, and then in 2/3 of the cases, they are posted by appointment of the president. The other 1/3 are the so-called political appointees, and these typically and most famously serve in London, Paris, Rome, like Peter Secchia of the first Bush administration, who was ambassador to Italy. And these are people who either have particular political merit, such as Mr. Secchia helping George Bush Elder win the Michigan primary and then carry Michigan in his race for president, or they may be fundraisers or major donors. I suppose I qualified under the old friend of the president category, because I certainly didn't qualify because of my intense knowledge of the Middle East. You know, Mark Twain said, "Confession may be good for the soul, but it's bad for my reputation." And I do not come before you as someone who has spent an entire career as an Arabist, as somebody who studied the Arabic language and had many assignments and postings. I came into the job of being a U.S. ambassador in a Middle Eastern country, which is very rare for a non-career person, through the vagaries of politics. Now, in addressing how that works, I really have to reach to a totally different sphere, namely that of the musical stage, because there is a famous songwriter named Sami Khan, and Sami Khan used to address the question that every songwriter is always asked, which is, what comes first, the music or the words? And Sami Khan used to say, what comes first? It's the telephone call. And that means that he would be somewhere in Hollywood, the phone would ring, it would be a producer who would ask a question like, can you write a song called Three Coins in a Fountain, or some such thing? And he, of course, said yes, and he would proceed to write the song. So, how did I get to be an ambassador? I got a telephone call one day. It was from the Director of Presidential Personnel, a job that I myself held for the first President Bush. And when the personnel director came on the line, I realized immediately two things. One is that it was about a job, because the Director of Presidential Personnel does not idly call people around the country to find out how things are going. And I knew it had to be an important job because she herself made the call, not a member of the staff. And it's true, it was about becoming an ambassador. And through the process, it was identified that I would be nominated, if I so chose, to go to Qatar. Now, I had never been to Qatar. I knew about it because as an earnest World Affairs Council member in Houston and reader of newspapers and magazines and the rest, I had an acquaintance with the country in general terms, but because I'd never been there, I'd never been posted in the region, it did raise the question of why this happened. And maybe it's because of some of the things that Mike mentioned in the introduction. It was never said to me in so many words, but there was a kind of logic. One is I'd been the director of the Voice of America. Briefly, I'm sorry to say, only about 17 months at the end of the first Bush administration, but because the all-encompassing major issue and source of aggravation for my administration when I was selected was Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is wholly owned by Qatar. It operates out of Qatar and broadcasts in now a number of languages, but the primary language is Arabic. And the voice of Al Jazeera in Arabic, reporting on the war in Iraq in particular, was considered by my administration to be a hostile voice. And therefore, I was told that that would be one of my prime assignments, was to do something about Al Jazeera. And I took on that assignment, and I told them that once I had done something about Al Jazeera, that I would offer to do the same for the New York Times, for the Washington Post, for CBS, and all the other sources of irritation that afflict many a president, not just that time. So that was one of the perhaps contributing reasons. The other is that education, particularly higher education, is very important in Qatar. It was the original design of the then wife of the emir, the mother of the current emir, to bring the University of Virginia to Qatar, an entire complete campus in all of its different disciplines, a very dramatic proposal that underscored the fact that this very dynamic, remarkable, and resourceful lady, Sheikha Moza bint Nasser, believed very much in Western education. She herself had not been to a Western university, but she recognized that in the Western education canon, critical thinking is most prized and most encouraged. She wanted that in lieu of the more traditional Eastern Hemisphere way of dealing with education by mere rote learning. Unfortunately, the University of Virginia, in the end, turned down her invitation. This was a stinging blow at the time, but she then hit upon a better idea. In many ways, it was fortunate that her original idea did not come to blossom, because what she did was to go to a number of U.S. universities and select them on the basis of their particular strengths. And that is why in Qatar today, there are 6 American universities, full 4-year institutions that give the identical diploma in Doha that they give in their home campus. That was part of the deal, that it not be considered an adjunct, a secondary level of education, but the complete education. So, as a result, we have Texas A&M, which is the School of Engineering, particularly petroleum engineering. There is Virginia Commonwealth University, which is the School of Design, Interior, Fashion, and Graphic Design. There is Carnegie Mellon, which is the School of Information Technology and Business. There is Weill Cornell, which is the School of Medicine. There is Georgetown, which is the School of International Relations and larger liberal arts. And then there is Northwestern University, which has the School of Communications. This assemblage of universities is called Education City. The Qatar Foundation, headed by Sheikh Moza, provided the cost of hiring world-class architects and building magnificent buildings for each of these universities to operate in a campus of campus just outside of Doha. And there are other ancillary activities, such as Convention Center, Research and Development Center, and even, if you will, a university for horses, a world-class stables called Shaka. Any event, I'd been working at the University of Texas Health Science Center as of the time that I got the phone call from the White House. I had also been the chairman of the State Board of Education in Texas on appointment of then Governor George W. Bush. The State Board of Education in Texas, and probably every state, is a controversial body. And in my office at the embassy in Doha, I often pointed to the certificate of appointment by Governor Bush to the State Board of Education and saying, this is why I am serving in the Middle East, is that it was deemed that having gone through that particular bit of controversy, that even the Middle East should be no problem. So maybe it was higher education, and I had been involved in government and politics, having been elected to public office as a state legislator and to the State Board of Education. The state of Qatar is not a democracy, but it is a proto-democracy in that they do elect what's called a municipal council. Municipal council is responsible for all the ordinary street and road and sewer and other regulatory requirements of a municipality, but because it is such a small country, about the size of Connecticut, the scope of this municipal council is nationwide rather than just for one city. So, having been an office seeker, an office holder, it was useful, I think, to be in a place that was just taking early steps toward democracy. Whatever the reason was, I was duly nominated and went before the U.S. Senate. When the hearing happened, and I should say that 99% of all nominations are very routine and uncontested, that only the occasional Kavanaugh or Bork or Gorsuch-style nominations get the kind of national attention and controversy that you've seen on television. But when that particular hearing took place, I had more senators on my side of the room than on the other side. That is, the 2 senators from Texas were kind enough to introduce me, and the 1 senator who was the chair of the Middle East Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee sat there, asked a few soft questions, and in time, I was confirmed. And when that happened, we had to go do the job. We arrived in Doha in August, the middle of August, and if you've been in that part of the world, it is even hotter than my part of the world. And people said, how is it that you came to us at the worst time, in the middle of August? And I said, well, there were 3 reasons. One is the president gave me this job, so I figured I should start doing it. The second is that our daughter is going to go to the American School of Doha, and they're starting classes next week. But the third was the Texas wisdom that you should eat a bullfrog for breakfast every morning because nothing you do the rest of the day could be as bad. And that's how it was. The weather got better and better and better. And in fact, for about 6 months of the year, the Persian Gulf area is delightful. It's like Southern California. The other part we won't talk about, but it is, let us say, endurable, especially in a very wealthy country that has the finest facilities and definitely doesn't have to worry about paying the energy bills to air condition it all. And in fact, I should say a little bit about the history of Qatar and its economic history in particular. The entire Persian Gulf area, and I include places like Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Doha, were, to be very charitable, backwater villages, fishing villages on the shore of the Arabian Peninsula. They were not of any great consequence, and for much of the history, the importance was not the land, but the water, the body of water that is generally known as the Persian Gulf, but what is known in the Arab world as the Arabian Gulf. And the wealth of the Arabian Gulf was pearling. That was the great source of income, in fact, the only real source of capital for these little villages that clung to the shore of the Arabian Peninsula for centuries. During the hottest months of the year, which is to say when the water was at its warmest, people would go out in pearl boats. From sunup to sundown, they would constantly jump into the water, holding on to a large rock to speed their descent about 50 feet or so to the seabed, and then opening their eyes in that very salty water without goggles, they would throw oysters into a crude bag of some sort made out of rope and yank on the rope for a buddy on the deck to pull them up. They could hold their breath underwater for about 2 minutes, but that was enough time to gather a bag full of oysters that were then thrown onto the deck, where nothing was done to them except the hot sun beating down upon them that caused the oysters to gasp for breath and to open up, such that at the end of the day, that is when sun was down and the evening meal and the evening prayer was held, then everybody would gather on the deck and they would open the oysters, and out of hundreds or thousands you might get 1 or 2 or 3 pearls. These were the common property of the boat. Captain, of course, had the share, but everybody gained from the income from the sale of the pearls to merchants from India, and eventually these pearls would get to Europe and the wider world. The great portraits of Queen Elizabeth I, where she is hung with strands of pearls, undoubtedly those pearls came from the Persian Gulf. And that was the source of wealth for those centuries until roughly the 1920s, when a gentleman named Mr. Mikimoto in Japan came up with the cultured pearl. And when that happened, the business for so-called seed pearls or natural pearls completely died away. And therefore, the countries that today are some of the very richest countries in the world were essentially destitute for a period of about 20 years or so. That 20-year period included the discovery of oil in the Persian Gulf area in the 1930s and the coming of the Second World War. And when the Second World War came, the Persian Gulf was definitely a backwater to the activities of the Allies and to the entire rest of the world. That was the period of time when the people of that part of the world were so desperately poor that they depended upon whatever they could get from the sea or take from date palms in order to survive. When the war ended, roughly about the year 1950, the oil resources began to be developed. Jobs were created very slowly as a result of the need for drivers and laborers. And then came the secondary benefits of merchants who were able to sell things and who could become the distributor for foodstuffs or Coca-Cola or automobiles. And then things began rising to the level that we're more familiar with, except that in the case of Qatar, the key time was the late 1990s. when the new emir, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, the husband of Sheikh Moza, who created Education City, decided to go into debt to develop the gas reserves, which are in immense quantity under the seabed. A bit of irony that the wealth of the place, such as it was for centuries, was just on the seabed, and the future wealth, the great wealth of Qatar, is under the seabed in a gas field that is shared with Iran. The international border down the middle of the Gulf divides the gas field, with Qatar having about 2/3 of it, Iran having the remainder. Qatar being the only country that truly has developed the gas resources. And by developing, that means pumping the gas ashore to immense long factories that are called trains. Has nothing to do with railroads, but a train takes the methane from the seabed and chills it to minus 261 degrees centigrade, at which point it becomes dense, a liquid. It can be then pumped onto some of the world's biggest tankers, and billions of BTUs can be transported to Europe or East Asia. Minus 261 degrees is so cold that when I went to watch this loading process in the middle of the summer once, there was thick frost on the outside of the tankers from that degree of cold. The nature of the LNG business was so successful and continues to be so successful that the debt that was incurred by Qatar to develop those gas resources was more than repaid, and today Qatar is the wealthiest country per capita in the world. And it takes a little footnote to say a little bit more about that statistic. You get the per capita wealth, according to the World Bank, by taking your population and dividing it into the wealth. Well, the population of Qatar is about 2.5 million, but the real number is the number of Qatari citizens. There are only about 300,000 of them, and that's men, women, children, all ages. They're the ones who actually own the wealth. The other 2 million or so people are expatriate workers, ranging from geophysicists hired by ExxonMobil or Shell, all the way down to laborers from Sri Lanka or Nepal or Bangladesh, who are just barely scraping by, although what they get is a whole lot more than they would have back home. So if you took the 300,000 who really own the wealth and divide it into the income of Qatar, you get a number so astronomically high that it is literally off the chart. What does Qatar do with this wealth? Well, happily, the wealth came to Qatar long enough after what hit Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain, other oil-producing countries in earlier decades. And the Qataris decided that they did not want to go in for, if you will, excess. Now, you will see on the skyline of Doha some amazing buildings, and they have used their wealth to develop an amazing airport and seaport, and they have successfully bid to host the World Cup in soccer in the 2022, all leading to the construction of something like 7 new stadiums and all the facilities required to host a World Cup in the way of freeway access, a metro, hotels, etc. So that is where the money has gone, but it has also gone into such things as education, creating education. That is because the wealth is there, undeniable, and it's certainly wonderful to have as your regular source of income. But the visionaries of Qatar, such as Sheikh Moza, wanted to create a society that depends upon human capital, brain power, rather like countries like Singapore or Korea or Taiwan that don't have very much, if anything, in the way of natural resources, but rely upon the energy and inventiveness of their own people. That is what the Education City and other facilities that have been developed aim to do, is to create that kind of a society over time. Once again, it's wonderful to have the wealth of the seabed to fall back upon, but too many other countries that have been blessed by resources have tended to let that, if you will, distract them from trying to develop the larger society. And that's why I've always said that if you go to Doha you will certainly be impressed by the magnificent office buildings, the great museums designed by world-class architects, and by the buildings at Education City. But it's what you don't see that is really the most impressive, and that is this approach toward developing human capital, particularly that of women. 70% of the student body in these various 6 universities I mentioned are women. That's because the young men, for a couple of generations, have been able to go abroad much more easily than their sisters and female cousins, and they did not need to have the Western universities there quite as much as the young women, whose families were open enough, if you will, liberal enough for them to have a Western-style education, but not quite so much as to send them overseas, certainly not to send them overseas alone, the way the young men have done for so long. Well, that's the most impressive part of what's going on. There's also the foreign policy angle, and that is that Qatar has exercised since about the mid-1990s an independence of foreign policy and an aggressiveness in foreign policy that far outstrips the size of a country that is very physically small and has such a tiny citizen population. It has played a role in almost every Middle Eastern conflict, from the situation in Gaza or in the West Bank to Lebanon to Syria to Yemen to particularly in its own immediate neighborhood. Plus the fact that Qatar sought and was elected to a seat on the UN Security Council, where it then had to take on not just regional problems, but global problems. This ambition to play a role is a reflection of the particular leader, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, the father of the current emir, and his foreign minister, prime minister, Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim. Together, they were the ones who pushed Qatar into having this very forward-leaning foreign policy. One of the other initiatives done by Sheikh Hamad was to build a 10,000-foot runway in the middle of the desert on the correct presumption, build it and they will come. And the they that he had in mind was the United States. For in that year, 1996, the Saudis invited the United States to leave. They had elements in Saudi Arabia roughly since the time of the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, and those elements, primarily Air Force elements, remained in Saudi Arabia until 1996. And we know that part of the, well, in fact, the strongest part of the argument used by Osama bin Laden and others was that the infidels, the crusaders, were occupying the sacred soil of Islam on the Arabian Peninsula, and that this was offensive to those of the jihadist mindset, such as Osama bin Laden. And therefore, the kingdom responded by asking the United States to depart. Well, it proved to be very fortuitous for Qatar because it was not very far to go from those bases in Saudi Arabia to a prospective new base in Qatar. And the Al Udeid base, which is a Qatari base, nevertheless has hosted American Air Force and other coalition elements roughly since 1996. Today it is a fully developed complex with air operations around the clock. It also has the forward headquarters of the U.S. Central Command. CENTCOM's actual headquarters are in Tampa, Florida, at MacDill Air Force Base, but the forward headquarters is in Doha. And that is a major asset. It's one of the reasons why Qatar was not in any way threatened by the imposition of the blockade by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Bahrain when that was imposed in June of last year. It was a very tense time because Qatar got about 90% of its food, including meat and milk, from Saudi Arabia. We don't usually think of Saudi Arabia as an agricultural country, but it is a producer. In fact, I found some of the best fruits and vegetables I'd ever eaten were those that we got that came from Saudi. That was closed off in the blockade. There was a crisis atmosphere for a few days as groceries disappeared from the shelves, but the Qataris responded as they could because of their financial ability to import food from outside using their fleet of very modern aircraft. They also had just opened a very major cold storage plant on the grounds of their brand new airport. They also had opened their brand new seaport and could import things by sea directly without it having to be transshipped at Jebel Ali, the port of Dubai. They also worked up a land bridge arrangement whereby food comes from Turkey by truck through Iran. It's then in roll-on, roll-off vessels that cross the Gulf, unload the trucks onto Qatar. The trucks go to the market, unload the gear, whatever they're carrying, and then repeat. This is a very fortunate example of how Turkey has been a good friend of Qatar in this particular time. And given that connection, you can see it's rather natural that Turkey has been as, shall we say, critical or even hostile to Saudi Arabia in the most recent episode, which I imagine we'll talk about during the question time. I mention all of this because the blockade has not at all succeeded in doing anything to change Qatar foreign policy, and the number one issue on the list of demands by the blockading countries was to unplug Al Jazeera. Well, that will never happen. Other things on the list which are equally impossible, such as, in effect, Qatar withdrawing as a forward-leaning foreign policy would likelier happen before Al Jazeera is unplugged, because Al Jazeera is such an asset and such a famous voice of Qatar to the larger part of the world. There have been dislocations from the blockade. You cannot, no one can fly directly between Doha and Dubai or Doha and Riyadh. You have to go through a third country, such as Kuwait or Oman. There have been some serious family issues because many Qataris are married to people of other nationalities in the Gulf, and some of those people were caught in another country at the time of the blockade, which meant that they could not return to Qatar. That, in fact, has become a human rights question that the United Nations has been asked to adjudicate. But from an economic point of view, and certainly from a security point of view, the blockade has not affected Qatar. In fact, in many ways, it has strengthened it because they've become more efficient. They have examined how they do things, like how they get food, and that has helped in the long term. And it has also strengthened the ruler, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the son of Sheikh Hamoza and Sheikh Hamad. He has become almost a celebrity in a way that the modest Qatari ruler or emirate has never been. You go to many third world countries and you see the maximum leaders photograph everywhere. That was not the case in Qatar, except photographs that you'd see in the usual places like a hotel lobby or a bank. But in Qatar, now you see a classic, iconic image of the ruler, Sheikh Tamim, everywhere, in stickers on windshields, on people's lawns, and the sides of buildings. So that has been, if you will, a unintended consequence of the blockade, which instead of undermining the ruler has strengthened him. So in conclusion, let me say that the luck of receiving that phone call and being posted to Qatar was to introduce my wife, daughter, and me to a fascinating and very vital country that, despite its tiny size, has managed to be the center of so much of what's going on in the entire region, and to be a center of American interest in a succession of administrations. Well, there are many topics I have not covered, and what I'm going to do now is to fall silent and take your questions, and feel free to ask any other thing that might come to your mind.
Yeah, I've got the microphone here. Let's thank Ambassador Untermeyer for getting us started. It's a marvelous talk. And I've got the microphone here, so I'll pass it around, and so everybody can hear the question.
Yeah, what?
Yes.
Could you give us a little background in the ethnic structure at Qatar? Were they just another Arab tribe? Was this sealed off by some prince that gathered some power, and therefore is there essentially no difference between they and those Omanis, or Saudis or others, or what is the background and difference between the different peoples there in that area?
Yes, this definitely would be the question for my wife, but having read her book, I can answer it. And that is that there is a great deal of kinship in that general area, such that many of the tribes, many of the families have been in that general area, which of course for a long time was undemarcated. It was just open desert. And therefore the nomadic or Bedouin people would roam wherever their particular herds or flocks needed to graze, or where they themselves could be able to find sustenance. That is one of the reasons, I believe, a very subtle reason, which lies behind the irritation of Saudi Arabia towards Qatar, because at any given time in the 20th century, Saudi Arabia could have occupied Qatar as easily as it occupied other parts of the Arabian Peninsula, but it didn't. And therefore, a place that they considered insignificant in an earlier time is now a great challenge because of its wealth and its independent attitude. So there were two, if you will, activity groups. There were the Bedouin, the people, the nomadic people of the land, and then there were the Hadar, which you could say were the seafaring people and the merchants on the coast who dealt with all commerce of some sort. Qatar is about 90% Sunni. The 10% who are Shia are not like the Shia in many other countries, like next door in Bahrain, which tends to be the lower socioeconomic group. Some of the richest people in Qatar are Shia. That's because they are the descendants of original Persian merchants, originally who settled in Bahrain, eventually got to Qatar, and they were the business, they had the business acumen to take advantage of that first wealth that came in with the development of oil resources. And as I mentioned, the bulk of the population are people who are from other countries, primarily low-wage workers. They work on contract. They will leave after a certain period of time and likely be replaced by other people from those countries.
And Ambassador, you mentioned that those workers are from many different religious groups, and they're allowed to worship as they wish to?
Yes, the bulk, particularly from countries like Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Pakistan, are Muslim, but there are other ethnic groups who have other religions. There are a large number of Indians in Qatar. In fact, there are far more people from South Asia than there are Qataris. I always said that I had a very easy job as U.S. ambassador. I, of course, had to deal with strategic international economic issues, but the Indian ambassador was like the mayor of the biggest city in Qatar. That is, the hundreds of thousands of Indians looked to the embassy to try to be of assistance whenever they had any kind of problem, such as labor disputes. And that was a job that I did not have to have. The American population in Doha was quite happy as long as the American School of Doha was running well. They were happy, and I didn't have to worry about my constituency that way, the way the Indian ambassador did. And the Indians who are working in Qatar tend to come from the southwest coast of India, which is the Christian part of India. So for the most part, the Indians who are in Qatar are Catholics, and the Filipinos are, of course, Catholics. They're there largely because they have English language skills. So Filipinos tend to have next higher level of job where you need English skills, such as working in a hotel or restaurant or some other place with contact to the larger international community. And I should say, finally, that the former emir, Sheikh Hamad, designated a very large tract of land outside of Doha for the construction of Christian churches. And that started with the Catholic Church because Catholics were and remain the largest Christian element in Qatar. But there were also churches for Anglicans/Protestants, the Coptic religions of Egypt, and the Orthodox religions of Greek and Eastern Orthodox. So that is a very radical thing, inasmuch as next door in Saudi Arabia, no one can practice any religion except Islam unless they are clandestine.
I wonder, do many of the citizens work full-time jobs, or do they primarily live off stipends from the government? And secondly, what percentage of the population are still, citizens are still Bedouins?
I wish I could answer the question. The Bedouin stock is by far the largest stock of Qataris, but there are essentially no Bedouins left, people who wandered through the desert. Their descendants are now working in the kinds of jobs that the bulk of the citizen population have, such as government positions. That is true, incidentally, of the other parts of the Arabian Peninsula, where government employment is a very, very high, in many ways excessively high economic engagement versus the private sector. Now, I would estimate maybe 70% of the actual jobs held are in some way government jobs. The 30% are purely private sector. But a large number of the people who have government jobs, shall we say, do not work full time. They, in fact, will leave early in the afternoon to go tend to their business. So many of the people who are in government also are in business. These are family businesses. There is entrepreneurial activity, to be sure. But for the most part, it is the government that tends to hire people. Now, the National Petroleum Company, is that government? Is it private? They operate as if they are a private company, an independent oil producer, but of course it's owned by the state. When I say government, I'm thinking people who work in ministries of some sort or another. And that is a kind of subsidized living. There are other kinds of subsidies that people who are citizens receive, such as free health care, including being treated for any disease anywhere in the world. And when that happens, you can take family members with you at government cost. The education to the ultimate, you want to pursue education also anywhere in the world. With regard to the medical care, when I've come back from flights to Doha, I'm leaving in 48 hours to go there, and a week from Friday when I come back, when I step off the Qatar Airways plane into the jetway, there will be a line of 20 to 25 wheelchairs ready to take patients from off the flight to go to the institutions of the Texas Medical Center, primarily the MD Anderson Cancer Center and the Texas Heart Institute. So that's just an example of how healthcare is subsidized, and it's one of those many benefits of being a citizen.
You mentioned that Qatar is going to host the World Cup in 2022 during the summer. And
actually, it's going to be in the fall. Normally it's in the summer, but they're moving it, FIFA is moving it to the fall.
Okay. Can you, do you have any thoughts about how that's going to go, how they're going to manage the heat and all the tourism and attention?
Yes, well, I've always said about Qatar that if it's a problem that can be solved by writing a check, then it is a problem that can be solved, and this is a problem being solved by the construction of stadiums, I'll get back to those in a moment, hotels, and all other kinds of facilities to take care of people. In fact, the infrastructure is definitely going to be in place, and for soccer fans who might like to go watch the World Cup in 2022, this will be the easiest of all because it is such a small country. People will be able to see 3 games in a day just by jumping on the metro and going to a different neighborhood in Doha where there's a new world-class stadium available for them, as opposed to the way it is when World Cups are held in large countries like Brazil or Russia, where people have to get on airplanes and maybe would be lucky to see 1 game a day, and more, probably less likely than that. The stadiums are built according to FIFA standards. FIFA requires stadiums to be open, and that is defined in some way that the models that I've seen of all the stadiums are enclosed except to that point that is considered the minimum amount of openness. Air conditioning is going to be pumped in through the stadium the FIFA concern is not about the audience, but about the players on the field. So the field has to be at a particular temperature. And that's what these great gusts of air conditioning are going to do. I've said that I would like to have the parka concession during the World Cup because it's going to be very cold sitting in those stadiums. Some of the stadiums, incidentally, were designed to be deconstructed, and they will be given to countries in the third world to become their stadiums. So there will be a secondary life for the stadiums in the future, because after the World Cup is over, you don't really need 9 stadiums, and they can get by with 3 or 4. Yes?
How do you become a citizen?
It is possible to become a Qatari citizen, but it is like becoming a British lord. That is, it doesn't happen to everybody. You have to have special merit. Also, it helps to be Muslim, although there is a gentleman with the wonderful name of Dr. Ibrahim, who was an American citizen, but he was the energy advisor to the former emir, and he was granted citizenship, and he proudly called himself the only Christian Qatari. But everybody else, it is just a rare thing that anybody can become a citizen. There certainly is no naturalization or other process by which people go through. It's granted from the top by grace of the emir.
Excuse me?
Yes.
How about those athletes, especially football? I hate the word soccer because you American call something football. It's not a ball, and
yes,
you guys
yes.
to play it with foot. So again, my question is about the athletes who been granted citizenship. A lot of them come from South America or Africa.
Yeah.
Most of them come from non-Muslim background. So are they real citizens or just citizen for purpose? And when they done, they have to get back their citizenship. I'm just interested to know about that. If you.
Yes, I haven't examined their contracts to know about that. It is clear that there's an advantage to being an athlete in order to get citizenship, but even that is rather rare, and it depends on what the FIFA rules are with regard to competition, and I frankly don't know what those are. But you are describing that the bulk of people who are made citizens are usually athletes or others who have a particular valuable skill. I mentioned Dr. Ibrahim. His valuable skill was knowledge of the energy industry.
You mentioned that the boycott by Saudi Arabia and UAE and others is not effective. How do you see that playing out? What other types of pressure do you expect these nations to impose upon this country?
The blockade has not succeeded in the strategic sense that the planners wanted. It does have these inconveniences to family issues that I mentioned, but nothing that's going to destabilize the state, cause a change of regime, or any financial difficulty. There has been a cost. There's no doubt that it is not helpful, but Qatar can survive because it's got a small population and great wealth. I tend to think the answer to your question as to how it's going to end is it will end quietly. It will just sort of go away, largely because it is such an embarrassment, particularly to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and especially Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates, who many people feel was the real mastermind of the blockade. It's such an embarrassment to them that they embarked on this and it hasn't succeeded, that it's not going to lead, I think, to a peace conference of some sort where a document will be signed and fraternal embraces engaged. It will just kind of go away. And if it really lasts a while, I would suspect that the onset of the World Cup in 2022 will make a difference, because I would imagine many Saudis and Emiratis of high level would like to go to the World Cup, and they're going to have to end their blockade in order to get there, and I suspect to get tickets.
Thank you. You mentioned some 70% of the students at the universities were female. What percentage of the workforce or of the government positions are held by females?
I would estimate something like 25 to 30%, but that is a sharply rising number because the young women recognize that they have every opportunity. They have certainly every opportunity from an educational point of view to pursue degrees. They are, as a result, very energetic, ambitious, and very capable. Meanwhile, their brothers and male cousins are right now in Starbucks, and they're looking at their phones, or they're going out and racing their cars in the desert. I don't want to condemn them as a group because there are many young men who are also very energetic, ambitious, and able. But at the end of the day, they know that their families will certainly sustain them in some form or fashion. And the young women are the ones who recognize they have these opportunities in government or the National Petroleum Company or working abroad. That is very exciting, and that's why I'm convinced that they are the truly dynamic force. This was recognized by Sheikha Moza and by her husband, and it's the proof of why the Arab world and other countries, by keeping women down, are denying themselves huge human energy resources to develop their countries, and it's very impressive as a result. It also, I might add, has a sociological angle, and that is that many young women do want to marry and have families, but marriages are still arranged between families in that part of the world. And it usually happens in that a mother or grandmother or aunt will basically inform a young woman whom the family has decided that she will marry. And for eons, that was always accepted. Now, imagine a young woman who graduated from Texas A&M and is working as an engineer in the National Petroleum Company is told that her family has decided that she is to marry her cousin Ahmed. And she might say, Ahmed? I mean, he barely finished high school, and he's right now racing his car in the desert. And that's true. That is, you can see already that even though men still have a commanding position and wealth in that society, they are not necessarily at the same level from a educational or professional point of view as their prospective brides. And this, well, I can't tell you how the story is going to end. That is a drama that's probably being played out every day now in modern Qatar.
In your role as ambassador, how do you work with the career foreign service officers that were also at the embassy?
Yes, that very good question, because there is no necessary tension between career foreign service and non-career officers. I'm sure it has happened in the past, and it probably has happened with those so-called political appointees who, for reasons of their own mistaken analysis or what somebody told them, has been told you can't trust those people, you have to watch them, you have to be on your guard. That to me is the wrong way for any political appointee in any department of the government to deal with career people. And I'm talking about the Department of Commerce and the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. Those are places where political appointees can arrive, and it's their choice. If they want to believe that the people they're working with are sneaky and untrustworthy and out to get them, then they'll probably find that to be true. That is, it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But those who feel like they can benefit from the expertise and experience of those people and who have the people skills to bring them into line with administration policies can usually find cooperation. And yes, in a federal government that has millions of civilian and military personnel, there are bound to be some who are what we're now popularly told is called the deep state, people who want to sabotage the policies of the president. There's bound to be people like that, but for the most part, the career service, be it the foreign service, the civil service, or the military service, wait for leadership. And that was my attitude, that I would provide that leadership, and I would trust people until they disappointed me, but I, with few exceptions, didn't find that to be the case. I found foreign service officers and other professionals with whom I dealt to be there waiting for guidance, and if they needed motivation, then I was there to provide that motivation. It's an ancient battle that will never be finished and never adjudicated as to what kind of person makes a good ambassador. Is it the career foreign service officer who has had many years of experience and may have language skills and cultural knowledge that the political appointee lacks? Or is it the political appointee who might have the people skills, particularly the skills of a business executive who has many product lines and many branch offices and many, many employees, who has to be able to get everybody to work together for the common good, that is, the good of the company. And there are arguments to be made on both sides, and it, as I say, it will never be ended. It will also, there'll be people who fervently believe that it's only one side or the other. But it, as always, it depends upon the individuals and how they decide to interact. Let's see, this side of the room, for some reason, is not as curious as this side of the room.
Much to the delight of the Iranians, the murder of Khashoggi in Istanbul has dominated the news in the last couple of weeks. How has the Emir reacted, and is there any relevance of Qatar to Saudi Arabia in that respect? And how did Al Jazeera cover the news?
Yes, I wish I could answer the Al Jazeera question from certain knowledge. But I think it would be said that all they have to do is just report the facts that are known, or at least to interview the people who are giving their views. There is nothing to be gained by the state of Qatar, or for that matter, Al Jazeera, by trying to propagandize this episode. After all, the Qatari government doesn't have to do a thing with regard, or say anything with regard to what's going on, because their blockader, the Saudi government, is making a general mess of matters, and therefore it can only redound to the benefit, by comparison, for Qatar. I don't believe that that any statement has been made officially, other than what other countries, including the United States, have said, that there should be a complete investigation, that the facts should come out, that we should withhold judgment until those facts are revealed and weighed, and that's the proper response for any particular country, including our own. But to say again, the way that it has been mishandled by the Saudi government does redound by inference, or by, let's say, counterpositioned to Qatar's benefit, just because these are the people who have blockaded Qatar, and it doesn't make them look any more attractive or impressive.
I've talked to a few Qatari young men who describe having studied abroad, lived the frat life, then come back to Doha and cloak their wild ways, but behind the scenes are still very much experiencing a broader view of the world, religion, and that. Any sense of how you see kind of the future of Islam in Qatar as the younger generation gets more and more exposed to Western education and pluralism and some of those ideas?
Yes, it should be noted that Qatar is of the Wahhab strain of Islam, the same as Saudi Arabia. And people say, well, that means public executions, or women forced to be veiled, etc. And the answer is no. It points out how cultural differences are much more determinative, and there can be such cultural differences amongst very similar people, essentially identically the same, across a border. In Saudi Arabia, because of the 250-year-old agreement between the Al Saud and the Al Wahhab, whereby the Sauds became the temporal rulers and the Wahhabi became the spiritual leaders or guides. That has created a different society, a different culture in Saudi Arabia than you see next door in Qatar. So you can say that Wahhabi Islam is very conservative, but it isn't necessarily, and therefore, jihadist or Salafist in any way that would cause the society to act a particular way. But I do emphasize the fact that it is a conservative society, that men and women both dress modestly. That's an important point to make, that often people think that if women wear veils or if they choose to hide their face, that this is imposed on them. It is not imposed on them in Qatar, but women choose to dress like that because they are by nature conservative, at least amongst themselves in Qatar. If they travel abroad or within the confines of the home, they will dress, I'm reliably informed by my wife, either in very elegant couture from Europe or in jeans and sweatshirts. But outside on the street or in formal gatherings, they will be dressed in a traditional way. So that kind of attitude is much more likely to be untroubled or unaffected by such things as foreign travel, foreign study, exposure to Western notions of doing things, because that kind of benefit, if you will, of different forms of expression or different forms of opinion is being encouraged in Qatar, especially through these universities. It might be less so across the border in Saudi Arabia, but in Qatar it is encouraged. And yet, to look at the people and to quiz them on their faith, you will get pretty much the same answer. And then we'll go back to the left.
I was just wondering if you could tell us about any of the personalities that you interacted in an official capacity in the Qatari's government, people in the Qatari's foreign ministry, for example, people in high society in Qatar. Didn't know if you had any you could
Yes,
tell.
well, once again, a very small country with a very, very small leadership group. It is a very talented leadership group. And the principal personalities I dealt with, who now seem almost like the founding fathers of a modern state, began with the Emir, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, who took over from his father in a palace coup. To call it a coup suggests tanks and weapons and troops. This was more a matter of his calling his father, who was vacationing in the south of France, and telling him not to show up at the office the next week. That he was now in charge and he had the support of other members of the family. And that was because it was felt that his father, Sheikh Khalifa, had been essentially hoarding the money, which at that time came entirely from oil as opposed to gas, rather than to spread it and develop the rest of the economy. So it was Sheikh Hamad, with his amazing, remarkable partner, Sheikh Moza, who began, once they attained power, to develop the gas resources, to have a outward-leaning foreign policy, to acquire an Al Jazeera, to build an education city, to construct a 10,000-foot runway and get the United States to have a strategic relationship. All that began in a very short period of time, just in 2 decades ago. Another key player was Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim, who was the foreign minister and prime minister, and on his own, his private business, an exceedingly wealthy man who has many, many business interests globally. And he, together with the emir, were very much the intellectual force and the personal force that brought about the modern state. And then there was a marvelous man, Abdullah Al-Attiyah, who was the energy minister, and it was he who provided the leadership and the knowledge to develop the gas resource and to market it. He became president of OPEC about 6 times because of the respect his fellow energy ministers had. So those three in particular, and there were many other important leaders of the state, but in my dealings, frankly, just those three people were pretty much the core. I left out a finance minister named Yusuf Kamal, who's very, very sophisticated and was able to hold his own with other finance ministers from the Western world. So that group, and they're retired now, is less, were very much the founding fathers. I should say that Sheikh Hamad, the emir who did all these things, voluntarily transferred power to his son, Sheikh Tamim, in 2013. He had served 18 years as emir. He didn't have to step down. There was not any political problem. He was not going to get a phone call from his son telling him not to show up at the office, but he voluntarily did it. And that is rare, very rare in the Middle East. In fact, you remember Hosni Mubarak was the president of Egypt. He was president of Egypt roughly for 30, 35 years. A scholar told me that that meant that Hosni Mubarak, in the 5,000 years of Egyptian history, was the third longest ruling individual. And the story was told how one night the spirit of Allah appeared in the study of Hosni Mubarak. And Allah said, "Hosni, it is time for you to say goodbye to your people." And Mubarak looked up and said, "Really? Where are they going?" So that was the attitude that Sheikh Hamad decided to challenge by voluntarily stepping down and passing on power. But his son had been raised to rule and was ready to rule when the time came.
You mentioned that Saudi Arabia and Qatar have bad relations. And Turkey has become an ally of Qatar. Do you think there's any influence with Turkey's behavior or attitude with the assassination trying to help Qatar maybe get the blockade ended?
Well, the answer to your question says more about modern Turkey than even Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And that is a rather remarkable development. We all know that the Ottoman Empire went out of business roughly in 1918, and as such, Turkey, in effect, became a unitary state on the Anatolian Peninsula, a little bit of Europe on the other side of the Bosporus. In modern times, Turkey has become a much more outward-looking place to realize that it can have great influence in its former empire and in associated areas like Central Asia that have Turkic influence over the centuries. So much better than being a sultan of old where you had to govern hostile peoples in a territory, Recep Tayyip Erdogan realizes that he can exercise a great deal of influence through economics. And as a result, there have for many years been great investments by Turkey in Qatar and Qatar in Turkey. There have been prime contracts given to Turkish construction companies to build museums and hospitals and hotels and other major landmarks in Qatar. So, if you will, the current attitude that Erdogan is demonstrating in this speaks more to his leadership in the Muslim world than it does necessarily to his being allied with Qatar and Qatar having problems across the border with Saudi Arabia. There, needless to say, is a lot of overlap, and I wouldn't say they are totally disconnected, but I do believe that the position Erdogan is taking is his larger view of the role of Turkey in that part of the world. Yes?
I have two questions. The first question is, as you know, Qatar has a good relationship with Taliban. At the same time, we are in Afghanistan fighting Taliban. How would you see that? Is that politically? Yes. The second question I have, Qatar is such a small country. Why they have to buy F-15, F-16? What's the reason for that? Are they going to war with anybody?
Talking about the relationship with Taliban, this is very important because in the list of arguments that the blockading countries listed against Qatar, Qatar's having relations with Taliban, Hamas, Hezbollah, Muslim Brotherhood were very much, I would say, right under the broadcasts of Al Jazeera as an aggravation. But the answer is the old word realpolitik that World Affairs Councils get thrown at them from time to time, and that is these entities, Taliban in Afghanistan, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, are facts on the ground. They exist, they are powers in those countries, and it's been the view of Qatar, and this is one of those bits of independent attitude in foreign affairs that has gotten it crossways from time to time with even allied nations like the United States. It believes that it needs to have ties with these entities because they are facts. This is particularly true with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Now, the fact that Qatar has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood has been a major source of aggravation, of course, by Egypt, but also by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And yet, in 2011, when the Egyptians were allowed to have a free election, the Muslim Brotherhood won. And I predict that if ever Egypt has a free election again, the Muslim Brotherhood will probably win that as well. It's just the fact that they are very powerful and very influential. This specific item you mentioned, the Taliban, equals not that they have good relations, but they have relations. That is, they invited the Taliban to open an office in Doha. Why did they ask the Taliban to do it? It's because the United States asked Qatar to invite the Taliban to operate out of Doha so that we have a means of communicating with this entity that we've been at war with for 17 years. And that is of use to the United States. It's also of use to the United States to have an entity that can talk as need be to rather noxious elements like Hamas and Hezbollah as well. The other question you asked had to do with, remind me, please. Yes, about the defense buildup. For many years, which is to say during the time of Sheikh Hamad, the father of the current emir, Qatar did not invest in arms at all. It did have half a dozen French Mirage fighters, and that was about it. And this was because Sheikh Hamad, first of all, he had been the defense minister under his father. And when he became the emir, he kept the defense ministry unto himself. And why was that? That was because he knew that defense ministers have a great appetite to buy things, to buy weapons systems. He had other plans for the money of Qatar, building universities, building hospitals, building roads, sending people abroad. All those uses of money was what he wanted to do. He did not want it to be diverted for arms, largely on the grounds that they weren't going to go to war with anybody. They had the United States there to defend them against Iran in the first instance and maybe unfriendly neighbors in a second instance. Sheikh Tamim, the new emir, or new for the last 5 years, has always been interested in defense, security, and intelligence. So it's very much his initiative to begin to purchase arms from the United States, which is another change because France was the arms supplier such as it was in prior years. So essentially Qatar is doing what the neighbors have. The neighbors, that is United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, also have American fighters and other military craft. It isn't necessary for actual warfighting, but Qatar did get involved militarily in Libya in the fall of Gaddafi. The 6 Mirages, or at least those that could still fly, were sent to Libya to participate in allied efforts against the remnants of the Gaddafi regime. But why does any country, I mean, why does the United States have the military power that we have? Some people wonder why we have excessive amounts of planes and missiles and ships, etc. And that is, it is hard to say for any country what is too much, but there's always the danger of having too little. And I think a combination of self-defense and smart alliances, such as with the United States, is a good model for Qatar.
Hey, it is 8:15, so we're going to dismiss now. But if you didn't get a chance to have your question asked, the ambassador will be here for a few more minutes. You please come up to the front and ask him your question. Let's thank him again for a great discussion. Very, very, very enlightening. We've had 2 great sessions. We're going to take a little bit of a hiatus, but November 13, we will be back here, and Dr. Abdullah Al-Reb will be leading us in a conversation on Saudi Arabia. That should be extremely interesting. And then a week later, on the 20th, we're going to be talking about Yemen. So take a little bit of a break, but do come back November 13 and 20 and join us again. Thank you.